Since the PS5 launched, Sony has been making internal changes to its DualSense controllers. Assumingly, they are doing it to make the controllers more reliable. To this date, there have been 4 versions, which are commonly referred to by the BDM numbers that appear on the boards inside. Today I'm going to do an in-depth comparison of these controller variations, talking about what's different both inside and out. This will include partial teardowns. I'll also show you a way to tell which version you have without opening it. I do have chapter titles if you're interested in just certain parts of this video. Also be aware there may one day be a 5th version of the controller, and if so, I'll just add a note about it in the description. First, let me show you how to determine which version you have without going inside. On the back, there's a bunch of tiny text showing the model number and a bunch of other stuff. And there somewhere is the serial number, which can identify which BDM you have. It's tiny and it's hard to spot since it doesn't have the words serial number in front of it. However, if you scan the QR code that's in that area, your phone will tell you what the serial number is, saving you a lot of hassle. Since it's a tiny QR code, you'll need to zoom on your phone's camera a little bit first and then point it at the code. The number will show up as a simple text field within the camera preview. The second digit within that serial number identifies which of the 4 versions you have. A 1 is a BDM-10, a 2 is a BDM-20, a 3 is a BDM-30, and a 4 is a BDM-40. That QR code can be very useful if you're looking to buy a certain version on eBay. If the buyer posted a good quality photo of the back of the controller, one that's well lit and in focus, you can scan it off your monitor or whatever and figure out which version they are selling. Now I'll start with the comparison. For the rest of this video, I'll be referring to these controllers as Gen 1, Gen 2, Gen 3, and Gen 4. The first thing I did was weigh them in grams, and there wasn't much of a difference. The Gen 4 is the lightest, but I don't think anyone is going to notice a difference of 4 grams when they're holding it. 4 grams is about the weight of a nickel. I also took the time to just stare at the exterior of each controller to see if there's any kind of cosmetic differences, and I did not notice any. The colors happen to be different on a couple of these, but I suggest you don't rely on that as a determination of the version. The times that they changed the colors may not correspond to the times that they changed the boards. That being said, if they release a new color, it's likely to be one of the newer gens. This volcanic red one only became available in early 2024, and it's a Gen 4, but it's possible future volcanic reds may be a Gen 5. So once again, color is not a reliable indicator of the board inside. I also tested how the buttons feel when I press them. The trigger buttons on Gen 1 and Gen 2 felt slightly harder to push compared to the other ones. As for the other buttons, I did not perceive a difference, and I didn't feel anything different about the analog sticks. I did notice a major difference in the way the buttons sound when pressed. The L1 and R1 each seem to have a different pitch for each gen. That same sound difference happens with the square, triangle, X, and circle buttons too. I don't think it's the buttons themselves that are different. I believe it's more about how the sound resonates through the inside of the controller. I believe the various differences in the components inside change the way the sound bounces around. Speaking of inside, it's time to start taking things apart. I'll start with the R1 and L1 buttons, which have to be popped off to reach some of the screws. After popping them off, I compared them, and I noticed that the ones for Gen 1 and 2 appear to be identical. But when you compare those to the Gen 3 and Gen 4 ones, the middle part is longer and slimmer, and I saw no differences between the Gen 3 and Gen 4. So basically, I think they made one change to this button over the years, and it's possible that it makes it more responsive, and it may also account for some of the differences in the way it sounds when pushed. With those buttons removed, I can peek into the gap and pull the trigger button back to reveal some other differences. Now, some people use this gap as a way to identify which version they have, but I don't think that's necessary since you can just scan the QR code. Still, I'll go ahead and just show them all right here in case you still want to use them as an identifier. With the screws removed, I can now remove the bottom covers. From afar, they look the same, but there are some differences in the top of the molding. And there's some differences in this protrusion that was behind the trigger mechanism. Out of curiosity, I tried to see if the Gen 4 cover would fit on a Gen 1 controller, and it mostly does. There is a little bit of a gap that forms on the sides, and I could not force it shut. I then compared the components that are visible with the backside off, and this is where the major differences can be spotted. I thought at first that the battery on the Gen 1 was different, but that was because it was flipped upside down. You may see footage of it upside down throughout this video because I didn't notice it till sometime later. As it turns out, the 4 batteries have the exact same specs imprinted on them, but there are differences in the model number that's imprinted on them. The Gen 1 and Gen 3 ones are LIP1708, and the Gen 2 and 4 are SNYHR37. I googled those numbers, but I could not find out anything about the differences between them. Perhaps they were just sourced from 2 different areas of China. For whatever reason, the Gen 1 has black screws, while the rest have silver screws. This makes a big difference when taking things apart since it's easier to spot the silver ones. Also very noticeable is the variability in the number and placement of those various screws. The Gen 1 and 2 both have 2 that are visible from this vantage point, but the Gen 3 has 8 screws and the Gen 4 has 6. Another noticeable difference is the number of wires coming out the side of the board. The Gen 1 and Gen 2 have 2 on each side, but the Gen 3 and 4 have 4 on each side. The initial 2 leads to the vibration motor, and the extra 2 appear to go into the trigger mechanism. The ribbon cables that connect to the trigger mechanisms on the Gen 1 feel fragile when you touch them, but the ones on the Gen 2 are much thicker, and they're a different color. For the Gen 3 and Gen 4, they went with a much smaller ribbon cable. That may be why they needed additional wires heading into the trigger mechanism. Speaking of the trigger mechanism, this is by far what differs the most on all of these. They are large and complex since they are adaptive, so the housing around them takes up a lot of space. And the Gen 3 and Gen 4 ones just differ in the overall shape of that housing. The Gen 1 has little rubber bumpers here that the other gens don't have. Those others do have little nubs. Perhaps these nubs are what would hold those rubber buttons on them if they still put them there. For Gen 1 and 2, you can remove the entire mechanism by going to the back side of them and removing the 2 screws that are holding it on. Once they are removed, they can be swapped out, or you can dismantle them further by removing additional screws that are on them. For Gen 3 and 4, that mechanism seems more integrated. There are no screws on the back holding it on. It did not seem to me that you could separate the whole thing like you could in Gen 1 and Gen 2. Someone in the audience can correct me if I'm wrong on that. I was trying to be careful not to break them. I didn't want to be applying force to random spots, but I could not get them to come out. Even though they seem to be integrated, there are still some screws on them that hold them together, and by removing those, you can access the inside just like you could in Gen 1 and Gen 2. Another difference I saw with the Gen 4 is that it has this little colored blob under the triggers. I believe it's there to cushion the impact. I did not see similar blobs on the other gens. So this seems to suggest that they are seeing some wear and tear problems with the triggers being overpressed. As far as the board itself, there are differences in the placement of the chips. Each one of those boards has printed on it the BDM number. For Gen 2, 3, and 4, you have to flip it over to the side with the analog sticks to see the marking. For the Gen 1, it's printed on the opposite side as the others. As far as the analog sticks, the potentiometer doors on the Gen 4 are a different color. Other than that, I do not see or feel a difference between all the analog sticks. That pretty much covers all the differences I saw between the different DualSense generations. I hope you found this video useful or entertaining. I've done other videos about the DualSense as well as other controllers from other manufacturers, so check those out if you have an interest, and thank you for watching.